What if this ability you've always had to sense what others hide, to understand without needing an explanation, to keep forgiving long after anyone else would have walked away, wasn't an endless virtue, but a boundary that some people have learned to cross without ever asking your permission? And what if there was something dangerous inside every empath, something no one sees coming until it's already too late to turn back? Maybe you've already kept supporting someone when you had nothing left to give, kept trying to understand a person who no longer made any effort to understand you, kept reaching out to someone who had already shown you exactly what they would do with your trust. You were everyone's safe place, the person people turned to without ever asking whether you were okay, and you kept going long after anyone else would have left. What destroys an empath isn't the pain itself. It's the repetition, the same disappointment returning again and again until one day hope simply disappears. Imagine that one day you stop, not loving, but making yourself available. Imagine no longer showing up for people who never learned how to show up for you. Imagine your silence finally carrying more weight than all your efforts. Imagine your absence becoming more powerful than any explanation you could have given. Carl Jung observed that no one can keep sacrificing themselves indefinitely without paying a price. And when a deeply sensitive person finally reaches that limit, something inside them changes forever. What happens next has nothing to do with what most people imagine. When an empath is pushed beyond that point, they do not become aggressive. They do not seek revenge. They do something far more unsettling to the people around them. They disappear, not from their lives, but from their access. They quietly withdraw without confrontation. Because people rarely regret an argument, they spend much longer regretting a presence they took for granted. Carl Jung called this process individuation. The moment a person stops sacrificing their own vitality to maintain relationships that cost them more than they give back, it is the end of permanent self-sacrifice. The reclaiming of everything they gave up being just to avoid disappointing others. In this video, you'll discover what really happens when an empath reaches that limit, why their withdrawal often creates more consequences than any confrontation ever could, how people realize too late the value of what they had, and why this transformation, far from being coldness, is actually a form of inner maturity. The misunderstanding about empaths. There is a common image people have of empaths: someone gentle, patient, and always available. Someone who understands, never judges, and stays when everyone else leaves. What's interesting about this image is that it isn't wrong, but it completely misses what's really happening underneath. Here's what very few people see. An empath isn't available because they've consciously decided to be. They're available because not being available comes at a physical cost. When they sense someone's distress and choose not to step in, they experience something that feels like pain. Not as a metaphor, a real sensation in the body that only eases once they've done something to help the other person. That's why they stay. That's why they call back. That's why they answer messages at 2 in the morning, not because they're weak, but because their nervous system doesn't really give them much of a choice. Most people never see what this dynamic creates in an empath's life. They see someone who listens well, someone they can turn to, someone who genuinely understands. What they don't see is that this empath often comes home completely drained after a conversation that lasted only an hour. That they spend time recovering from emotions that were never theirs to begin with. That they know the most intimate details of other people's lives, while those same people would struggle to tell you their mother's first name. And despite all of that, they keep going, because they still believe that people will eventually see, understand, change. What they don't realize yet is that there is something inside them that no one sees coming, something silent and irreversible. And what happens the day that shift finally occurs is what we're about to discover now. How an empath is broken. No one breaks an empath all at once. It's never a single event, a dramatic betrayal, or even an argument anyone remembers. It's layers. Invisible layers that accumulate so slowly that neither the empath nor the people around them notice them settling in. It's the friend who only calls when they have a problem and hangs up once it's solved, never asking how you're doing. It's the conversation where you listened for 40 minutes while the other person walked away with a simple thank you, never realizing that you yourself had just gone through a difficult week. It's the moment when you realize, without really knowing when it happened, that you've stopped talking about yourself, not because anyone told you not to, but because over time you learned that your pain would never be received the same way you receive the pain of others. So you keep it in, you absorb it, you smile, and you say you're fine. When was the last time you said you were okay when you really weren't? To whom? And why didn't you tell the truth? Let me know in the comments. Sometimes putting words to that silence is the first thing we truly do for ourselves. What many people don't understand is that the empath who keeps showing up, who always responds, who never complains, isn't necessarily someone who's doing well. More often, it's someone who has learned not to show anything anymore, because at some point they tried to show something and it wasn't received. So they absorb the lesson in silence, and they keep going, carried by the stubborn hope that something will eventually change, that people will finally see, that balance will eventually arrive. That hope keeps them moving far longer than reason ever would. And in the next part, you'll see why that hope is exactly what makes what comes next so difficult for others to anticipate. Because there comes a moment when that hope disappears, and on that day, everything changes. The point of no return. The shift doesn't look like a breakup. It doesn't look like a decision made one morning after waking up. It feels more like an undeniable truth settling in quietly after one disappointment too many. Not necessarily the biggest disappointment. Sometimes it's something almost insignificant that simply confirms what the empath already knew but didn't want to admit. Nothing is going to change. It is this moment of cold clarity, not anger but understanding, that marks the end of something. The empath doesn't leave because they're hurt, they leave because they understand. And that distinction changes everything that follows. What most people don't realize is that, at this stage, the empath is no longer suffering in the same way. The active suffering, the kind that still hopes, still tries to fix things, that kind of suffering is gone. What remains is different. It's a form of inner calm that can look like coldness, but is actually the result of a long and silent process. This calm deeply changes the way the empath sees the people around them, what they are still willing to give, and most importantly, what they are no longer capable of pretending not to see. There is something about this shift that even many empaths struggle to name at first. They feel that something has changed, but they don't yet understand what that change will create around them. What this transformation reveals about the people who surrounded them, and why those people sometimes react in ways they never expected, is exactly what we're about to explore. Why others regret it. When an empath withdraws, the first reaction from the people around them is rarely regret. It's disbelief. They don't really believe it. They think it will pass, that it's temporary, that all they have to do is wait a little longer, and that waiting often lasts too long. Then a specific moment arrives. Not a dramatic revelation, just an ordinary situation, a difficult day, a moment when something feels wrong and the natural instinct is to reach out to someone. And that's when, for the first time, they realize there's no one there to respond in that particular way anymore. Not in that unique way. They call someone else. They talk. The other person listens, says the right things, offers the usual advice. And yet, something is missing. Something difficult to define at first. That feeling of being truly heard, not just listened to, of being understood before you've even finished speaking. It's only then that they begin to realize what they had. Some try to reconnect. They find someone who is polite and cordial, but the special warmth that used to be there, that sense of being welcomed without reservation, is gone, and you cannot force someone to reopen a door that you helped close. What regret reveals in those moments is often difficult to accept, because it isn't about something that was taken away from them, it's about something they let slip away. All the times that presence was there, available and freely given, and they never truly took the time to see it. The messages they left unanswered, the empath's needs they ignored, the way they treated them like an endless resource instead of a person who also needed care. That kind of regret is especially heavy to carry, because there is no one else to blame. And what it creates in the empath's own life, the way this transformation changes them forever, is what we're about to take a closer look at now. The empath's transformation. What an empath goes through after this turning point is often described from the outside as becoming harder, colder, as if they have lost the very quality of presence that once defined them. But that interpretation is inaccurate. What happens is not a loss, it is a reorganization. The empath has not stopped feeling. They have stopped placing their sensitivity in the service of people who did not respect it. And that distinction changes everything about how we understand who they become. They learn something that years of emotional absorption had made difficult to see, that their sensitivity is a resource, not an obligation, that they can recognize someone's suffering without automatically becoming responsible for it, that they can understand a situation without having to fix it, and that setting a boundary is not an act of rejection. It is an act of discernment. This shift from automatic caretaking to conscious discernment is a long process, and it does not happen without resistance. It challenges deeply rooted habits, it reshapes entire relationships, and it sometimes forces the empath to grieve losses they never expected to face. What Carl Jung observed about this process sheds light on the transformation in a way that few psychological frameworks can. The next part will help explain why this change runs far deeper than it appears, because it reveals not only what the empath is experiencing, but also why who they become is so difficult to undo once this transformation has taken place. Carl Jung's interpretation. Carl Jung did not study empaths as a category, but he spent much of his life observing what happens to people who build their identity around caring for others, who sacrifice their own needs to preserve connection, and who eventually reach a point where that sacrifice can no longer be sustained. What he observed was that these people do not heal by becoming softer or more available. They heal by reclaiming what they abandoned. Individuation, as Carl Jung described it, is the process through which a person stops living according to the image others have of them and begins living according to who they truly are. For the empath, this process inevitably involves integrating the shadow, reclaiming the parts of themselves they gradually pushed aside, the ability to say no, to disappoint others, to leave without explanation, and to protect their own energy before protecting everyone else's. These qualities are not flaws. They are necessary psychological functions that the empath learned to suppress in order to preserve relationships that were costing them more and more over time. Carl Jung observed that as long as a person fails to recognize these parts of themselves, they remain vulnerable to the same patterns, attracted to the same kinds of people, trapped in the same cycles. And the day they truly integrate those parts, something changes permanently in the way others can or can no longer reach them. This is not coldness, it is not indifference, it is what Carl Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to remain deeply sensitive while no longer being equally accessible to everyone. What the empath actually becomes after this integration, and how they begin to experience their relationships and their life differently, is exactly what we're going to explore now. What remains is not a shell. It is a more refined kind of awareness, directed differently. The empath still notices everything: the tension in a room, the sadness behind a smile, the things people hide without even realizing it. Nothing has gone numb. What has changed is that they no longer feel obligated to do something about it. They can sense someone's pain without carrying it. They can understand without stepping in. They can remain silent where they once would have rushed to fix things. That silence is not an absence. It is a presence that no longer pours itself out. There is something peaceful about no longer having to prove your worth by making yourself indispensable, about no longer confusing care with exhaustion. And perhaps this is where the inner question quietly shifts. No longer, what am I missing? But rather, what do I notice now that I couldn't see before? Who do I still allow into my life, and why? What have I been carrying for years that was never mine to carry in the first place? Maybe a part of you already recognizes all of this. If so, share it in the comments. What is something you notice in other people that you spent years believing only you could see? And when was the moment you realized that your silence was saying more than anything you could have explained? Write it in the comments below. I always read them carefully. But if an empath eventually stops sacrificing themselves for others, another question emerges. What happens when they no longer need to be loved, approved of, or validated in order to know who they are? The answer is more surprising than it seems. Click on the video appearing on your screen to find out.